Owen Eastwood, welcome to the Way of Champions, man.
I'm so pleased to spend this time with you, John. Thank you.
This is going to be a great conversation because your new book, Belonging, is so good. I have devoured it. I got it a couple months ago, the pre-release version, and I devoured it, and it's sat by my nightstand since, and I've gone through and I've referred back to it and reread a couple parts, not just in preparation for this, but just because I feel like it was this great reminder of, am I doing the right things in sport? And actually, you were just telling me a story about St. George's Park and sitting there listening to some youth soccer, youth football coaches. And so maybe you can start with that before we get into your background, because I think that's really about, have we made sport too complicated?
Yeah, no, we were talking about that. I had a meeting up at St. George's Park one day, and I was just waiting in the Starbucks there for my time to come around. And I just heard it was a youth football symposium, mainly coaches there that day as well. And there was a table beside me with some guys who were just chatting before they were going to their thing. And yeah, and I was eavesdropping a little bit. And I did hear, one of the guys say to the group that they'd read an article which said that in human endeavor, football was the second most complicated pursuit we'd ever invented, something along those lines. And then they all sort of agreed, and then they all sort of just focused on how complicated football was and how difficult it was to coach kids because of its complexity, etc. And I sort of sat there and I just thought, that's not a great mindset, I don't think, for coaching. I mean, first of all, I'm surprised by that. To me, it always appeared to be quite a straightforward game
Yeah.
in terms of getting the ball in the net and stopping the opponent doing it. But I appreciate there's a lot of tactics and technical stuff. But also just having that mindset that when you go into those, those kids, when you go into those teams, and that's your own mindset, this is incredibly complex. This is the second most complicated thing humans do. I just worry a little bit for those players and the people who are going to be part of that experience, because I really believe one of the big challenges for coaches is to simplify everything. And, certainly in my book, that's what I was aiming to do, is to strip it all back and simplify, what it is.
Yeah. And I love that, because that mindset of, if this is the second most complicated, ranking somewhere ahead of neurosurgery and whatever, then I have to pour all this stuff into these kids, and they're not going to be able to play until I have injected all my wisdom into them, instead of thinking about what can I strip away so that their true potential can come out. And so I think that story is a great segue into the book. And so what is belonging, this ancient idea? To talk about that, and maybe a little bit of your own history and story, because they're woven together.
Well, belonging for me is a biological fact. It's not a psychological theory. When we go into new groups, we have anxiety. That's ubiquitous across our species, is that we feel nervous, we feel anxious, and we can even feel a bit fearful because we want to be accepted by those people. We've got this hardwired need to belong. And there's an evolutionary logic to that, is that we didn't have a lot of physiological advantages compared to other animals, but what our super strength was our ability to form these strong teams and groups and hunt together and take care of each other and defend ourselves, etc. So yeah, our survival, and let alone our ability to thrive, has always been related to being part of a group, part of a team. Mainly kin, but it's widened out over time from there. So our need to belong is measured. Some teams actually measure this hormonally. They take blood tests to check people's anxiety levels and where their cortisol levels are relative to dopamine and serotonin, oxytocin. I try not to go into too much depth about that in the book, but again, I come back to this thing. It's a biological reality, And again, I'm not picking on football here because I love football, but I do remember, another coaches' conversations where I sort of explained this and they were nodding away, and then they said, "Yeah, no, I can fully see that." I'm not 100% sure it applies in football though.
Because these are not actually human beings, or
Yeah,
what?
well, it's beautiful. We're convinced ourselves that, this game, this very, very complicated game, has got its own rules and boundaries and
Yeah.
parameters, which is sort of aren't necessarily aligned with the rest of the.
It's like this conversation when my wife asked me to have, could I get dinner out 20 minutes earlier? I'm like, as if the laws of physics no longer apply in our kitchen, right?
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. We
But
all
but I
fall into that trap.
but I think the biology is really important, because I think people would say, "Oh yeah, belonging, that is just a psychological thing." But no, when we do talk about dopamine and oxytocin versus cortisol and other things, those produce very, very different things, right? Like, what one is, challenge, and one is fear. And
Absolutely.
that produces, and so the other physical effects of that are restricted blood flow versus better blood flow, harder to, you don't process oxygen as well. There's all sorts of physiological things that happen because of those hormonal responses
Mm,
that make you perform better or perform worse.
mm.
And I think if you
Yep.
said, if you listed them and said, "Coach, which one of these players would you like to coach today?" They'd all pick that one and be like,
Mm.
"Okay, here's how you do it," right?
100%. And if you want your players to communicate with each other on the field, and also off the field, build some relationships and build some trust and sense of togetherness, then you don't want to be marinating in stress hormones the whole time.
Hmm.
We need that oxytocin to be present, and we need to do certain things to spike it so that players, their behavior is fundamentally different if you're, swimming in oxytocin or not. And
Hmm.
if you want to be great at communication and great at having an awareness outside your own tunnel vision, then these things are important. So, I mean, my family are farmers, really, and they're very practical people where I grew up in the South Island of New Zealand. And I just find that talking around the biology and the hormonal part of this is sometimes more useful than talking about psychological models. Not to disrespect that in any way. It's critical, but just for my own understanding, I would just find it a bit more tangible and a bit more sort of hard evidence. And, there are teams out there today, and I'm sure you're aware of them as well, who literally are taking blood tests of their athletes every week, specifically looking at where their hormone levels are around what we're talking about here,
Hmm.
because they understand that will have a big impact on their performance.
Yeah, no, and it's so important. And it doesn't, I mean, this isn't, obviously, you work in the sports realm, but also in the military and even the business realm. And this sense of belonging and this fear versus challenge, it doesn't matter where it is. I mean, it can happen on your weekend excursion with friends to go hike a peak or ride your bike or something like that, especially when you don't know the group. Right?
Mm.
When you don't know the group, how will I fit in? Will this be okay? And you share a story in the book, which is a great one, about Michael Owen, the former Liverpool and Manchester United and Real Madrid England footballer, um, and contrast his sense of belonging
Mm.
at Liverpool and going to Madrid. So maybe share that, because I think, that idea of that first day experience, that really sets the table for, will I ever feel welcomed here?
Mm. Yeah, he shared that story with me, and I found it very compelling and powerful. And he just contrasted for me when we were having a chat, that time he had at Liverpool, where he came into the first team at 17 and was there for, I think, around 8 years or so, and became a superstar there. But forgetting all the superstar stuff, it was just a place where he felt this really strong sense of belonging. And what he meant by that was every day he went into that environment, and he could tell by the looks, expression on people's faces and body language, because he knew them so well, what mood they're in. And he would adapt accordingly. They had an intimate relationship with all those guys. It was a team. Gerard Houllier was the manager who not only knew his own parents, he knew Michael's in-laws. So after a game, Mark, the manager wasn't just talking to the players by any means. He was going over and talking to their parents and their wives' parents. It was a place where Michael could turn up, and if he was in a bad mood and he had a terrible sleep or whatever, he could tell people that. My energy's not great today. I had a terrible sleep, I'm not feeling great. And everyone would adapt and adjust around it, because he could be vulnerable and he could be honest, because they had that, trust and that sense of belonging. So as he describes it, it was a place where he felt mentally strong. He wasn't have to putting on an act. He's able to be himself. And he knew that those guys around him had his back, and they weren't, judging him. And, he obviously prospered there. He won the Ballon d'Or there, didn't he? He was, one of the very best players in the world during his time there. Then he had an opportunity to go to Real Madrid, which was the Galacticos even back then, had an amazing array of great talent. And when he was transferred over there, they did the shirt ceremony in the Bernabeu, and I think there's 25,000 people turned up on a Tuesday afternoon for that. But when he went into the actual team environment, he's in the dressing room and nothing's happened. He's not welcomed. There isn't any induction from the club or the manager that he goes through. There's nothing set up for him to have a conversation with the players. It was a tactical. It was a squad meeting. Then they went training, and this is what kept happening. And there were some massive egos in that dressing room, and people that he knew well and people that he didn't. And, the way he describes it, what I put in the book, is that this was a place where I'd gone from feeling like an absolute insider to an outsider. And what happened was he tightened up. And he felt like, I've got to prove myself every training session. These people, I don't belong here. I've got to prove that. I've got to establish that. And, it was that was a natural feeling. But the thing from my point of view was that the coaches didn't disrupt that and accelerate his settling down into that team, meeting his teammates, understanding who the hell Real Madrid really were. They got a great story, but he was never told it. He joined this great tribe, but no one actually took the time to explain their sense of identity to him. So that whole year that he was with them, he just never felt that belonging, and therefore never felt as relaxed and able to perform the way that he could have.
Yeah.
And, and that's the frustration that he's lived with.
Yeah. And I mean, you write in the book, when our belonging needs are met, then we can fully pour ourselves into the team. And that was missing for him. Even if he scored a goal, do I still belong here? Right. That you're always holding back. And I think it's just a perfect example that even at the highest level, sometimes they ignore this. And I think there's also this misconception that, well, if we just ignore him, and this happens a lot with youth moving into the first team setup, let's just ignore them and see how they do. Right. Yeah. And if they crumble, well then forget about it. They just didn't have what it takes. But that always amazes me, because you've had this 17-year-old in your club since he was 9, and you've invested these hundreds of thousands of dollars into his development. And then you take him for one test drive without making sure you got the right fuel in the tank. And if it doesn't work, you go, let's just throw out the car and go get another one. Right. Because clearly it was the car, it wasn't us. And I just think it's such a fascinating thing. But then from my perspective of working in the youth space, mostly, this is just as important as when a kid moves into town, right? That he or she feels like they belong from the first moment that they step on that field, and that they are welcomed. And it's just pretty interesting. And so I don't know where the question is in that, but
no, there's a
you want to extrapolate.
Well, there's a couple of things that jump out there. One thing, I'm actually not sure if I wrote it in the book, but I remember Michael telling me that, in Liverpool, in the dressing room, people are laughing, people are smiling, people are doing whatever, they're just interacting, okay, and you're just comfortable, and you feel good, and it's simple, it's straightforward. You're able to focus on your performance, and you're just, all of that environment's just there. You're comfortable with it. But he explained to me, in the Real Madrid dressing room, there were guys who would be sitting on the other side of the dressing room who would be speaking a different language, maybe Spanish or Portuguese or whatever. and looking at him. And he said it was crazy, but like I was starting to get a little bit paranoid. Like, are they maybe taking the mickey out of me? Are they maybe saying something about my training today? And this is what happens when you don't have a sense of belonging and you this anxiety persists, is that you leak so much energy and focus. Because again, if you're comfortable with your surroundings and the people around you, and you've got those relationships, then you really just focus on your performance and what you need to do. But when you don't, when you're getting all these signals from people around you and you're not sure how to interpret them, and in fact, whether they are hostile or not, that is a different situation altogether. And again, for a kid, for an elite athlete, it's the same thing. You will leak energy worrying about things like that and trying to interpret all of these things.
Yeah.
And it's just wasteful. But just one other point you made there, John, I think is massively important. I've also spent a bit of time in a gymnastics environment and in ballet as well. And across a lot of sports, there's this huge myth that if we make this uncomfortable, we filter out the mentally weak. So a lot of those sports, and even again like ballet, it's like a badge of honor that this is tough, and actually it's not very comfortable and it's not very relational. But that's good, because then we find out who the mentally tough people are. And I personally think it's BS. I think that is only a recipe to absolutely waste talent. And what we should actually do is create a great environment for everybody, so then everyone has a chance to thrive. And if you're a sensitive soul, or you're someone who's always been surrounded by strong belonging and strong trust, then you're not freaked out by the experience and rejected by it. Mm-hmm. So I really don't like that, and it does persist in sport, I find now. And it's just completely wasteful.
Well, like you said, I think it wastes talent, and especially when many athletes have this need to feel belonging before they will lay it all out there, right? Before they will compete at their top level, and not to overgeneralize, but especially female athletes in team sports, right? They want that bond before they compete. And this is from the research and stuff I've written about in my book, and other coaches as well, is how intentional that has to be. So if you don't forge that bond and welcome the newcomer into the group, she will never give her she will never compete. She'll never go all out. She'll never, and especially at a level where it's a young player coming into a team of stars that she's looked up to her whole life, or him, right? This isn't just there. And now you're saying, all right, go in hard on that tackle, right? Hammer that guy in rugby, whatever it is. It's like you're asking someone to, knock down the person whose poster has been on their wall the whole time they've grown up. They need to feel like, if I do that, I'm going to be okay, right? I'm not going to be sent home on the next taxi out of here. And so I think it's incredibly short-sighted to think that now I can understand to say, create the sense of belonging, and then let's put them under pressure and see what happens. But to strip away the belonging, you're never seeing the full player, the full human being.
No, I agree with that. It's as I said, it's quite common where people will basically say, prove yourself and then you can belong here. And we're just not wired that way. We're wired to seek belonging first and then to perform. And I think we've just got that bit about the wrong way. I mentioned also in the book, the South African cricket team who I worked with for, off and on for 10 years, which was a great privilege of mine. And one of the key things that we had to address was that the culture of the team was set up largely reflective of the Afrikaner people. Because they dominated that team for a long, long time. But the team had become incredibly diverse, obviously, in the last couple of decades. And in fact, I think on any given day, out of the 11 players, there's probably 6 different religions and ethnicities represented now. So it is maybe the most diverse team in world sport. But the culture was very reflective of like hard work, do what you're told, this shared ownership stuff, we're not having that.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't do your job, we'll give you a few games, but if not, then we'll replace you with someone who will do it. So it was
Right.
very, very harsh and pretty ruthless like that. So it was a very busy environment. They worked hard. It was very much very directive environment. Now, what happened, there's a pattern there that when people from ethnic minorities came into the team, there was a pattern of them underperforming.
Mm-hmm.
They'd come in and and even one of the most iconic players, possibly not a household name in the United States, but certainly an iconic player, Hashim Amla, who became the South Africans' first ever Muslim captain. When he came into the team, first year, this was an incredibly foreign environment for him, and he certainly felt like an outsider, and he's spoken about it. But, I think he averaged 11 runs, which in cricket is not great. He ended up his test averaging 48.
Mm-hmm.
So he was dropped from the team, was out for about a year or so, and then came back with a different mindset, having to deal with this situation. So he could have easily been wasted talent again. He got a second chance and he adapted in order to perform better, and also it coincided with the culture changing, so it sort of worked well for him. But it's just one example where so many players came into that environment, and because people were very hands off and basically prove yourself and then you can be part of the inner sanctum, they just felt like outsiders. Some of them felt like second-class citizens, and a lot of them never performed and were never able to deliver their talent. It's tragic.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, you talk about that team at different parts in the book, and going from, falling way down in the world rankings to getting back to number one, and all that. And we'll talk about some of these principles of the work that you did with them and with other teams. But I think what's really interesting there is you've got this, this attitude in the team of, prove what you got, or you're disposable. And then all of a sudden, every mistake is amplified. You and me are competing for the same spot, so why would I support you? And, I was listening to, and I've mentioned on the podcast here recently a couple of times, an interview with the Navy SEAL, Jocko Willink, and talked about what's the number one quality that you want in, a SEAL teammate. And he said, everyone thinks that, it's going to be, great shooter or fit or strong or whatever. He says, but no, the number one quality is, make your teammates look good, be a great teammate. Like if you have my best interest in mind and I have your best interest in mind, then the fact that you're a great shooter only helps me. And so that thing, creates this elite military unit. But I think within a sports team as well, right? If you are clearly a better striker than me in playing football or whatever, you know what? Like, but you have my best interest in mind, and you work with me and you help me. You're a great pro. I think of like Edison Cavani with Man United now, helping young players get better. I think of that and going, like, that's the kind of guy, like he might take my place, but every day in practice, he's helping me get better too. That's the kind of teammate I want to play with.
It's a type of teammate, and I do believe that those type of behaviors are shaped by the environment. And when I think back and when I played as a youth, I had some awesome team environments that I loved, and we created some experiences and memories and friendships that have lasted. And then there were some other teams I was part of that were horrendous. I mean, people were so selfish. People literally did not care about other people. They just wanted to go there and do their thing and have their own success, even to the point at times where people didn't really care if the team won or lost, as long as they got their stats.
Points or their stats. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I hated that. But when I think back on those times, I think the main point of difference was how passive or intentional the coach was. So there were multiple experiences I can think of where the coach was just passive around this. So the coach would train us, the coach would give us tactics, the coach would organize us. But around actually that teaming piece, it was really left to the group of kids. And it really depended then on the sort of quality and maturity of the people you had. And if you got a good bunch of kids together, and I actually think this still applies in elite environments, if you get a good bunch of people together, or sort of pointed in the right direction and well brought up, or maybe, or whatever, then that can create a great culture. But then it's just a complete sort of, crapshoot, really. And I think that's a bit mad. I think the coach has to have a real intent around those Cavani type behaviors. I need to engineer them by what I do. And it starts with belonging. If people are not feeling that sense of belonging, then it reduces the chance of connection. So let's address that. And teams like the New Zealand All Blacks rugby team are so intentional around inductions and things because they understand that. And they want to get it right from the start. So people turn up, and on day one in their first game, they're good to go.
So true. And I think it's not a secret. It's not like the All Blacks hide that, or the Seattle Seahawks and Pete Carroll hide that, or Steve Kerr and the Warriors, or whatever. Like these great teams are very open about doing this because they know it's hard to do. Right. And it's something that you have to do every day. So go ahead. If you're willing to, put in the time and the effort and whatever, great. But most people aren't. Right. And I think that is one of the big things that we use this podcast for is to, if our ultimate goal is that we want to create positive, affirming, life-changing sport experiences, regardless of age or ability, then creating this sense of belonging is maybe the most important thing that we do, regardless of sport, even in an individual sport.
I think if we get that right, it actually teaches all of us how to be leaders in other environments as well, if we've seen it done well. And I think actually a big issue is confidence. I think, like, I'm still surprised. I talked to some top coaches over here who've got every qualification literally possible, but some of this stuff doesn't seem to be in the curriculum, and they lack confidence. I suppose that's why some teams, invite people like me to get involved and help them do a bit of.
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, maybe it doesn't, because it keeps you and I in employed. But I don't think you're not secretive about this. Like, hey, here's a book. Like, you can do this, and maybe not as well as you do, but you can still be intentional about it and make it better than it is if you're not doing it at all.
I think absolutely, and a part of belonging, which is really important, is belonging to what. So again, when you come into a team or an organization or a club or whatever, I think it's incumbent upon the leaders to explain, this is who we are. This is our tribe. This is the team you've joined. And we are really, again, it's in the book, some of the science around this, but we're really wired to hear a story about us.
Yeah.
That's what the campfire was always about. It was where we listened to stories about us. And we're really receptive. And I've spoken to international sports people who have gone, into their team. They've been selected. They've been so excited. I remember talking to one guy who was like, as he was driving up to the hotel to join the team for the first time, he couldn't help himself. He started crying. It was just the moment that everything in his life he'd dreamed about was happening. Yeah. And he had to quickly sort of calm himself down and wipe away the tears, all the rest of it. And then he went into the hotel and joined the team. And he was like, I've got to keep this together. I've got to keep this together. This is the most emotional day of my life. I've got to keep it together.
Yeah.
And he was waiting for the moment where the emotional kicker was going to take place, but it never did. He went into a room and his kit was all laid out in a big kitting out room. So there's no intimacy or conversation or induction or ritual around it. It was all in its plastic in a box, and he went and picked it up. And okay, that's a bit anticlimactic. Yeah. Then he goes to his first team meeting like half an hour later, and the coach didn't even mention him and the other new caps. It was like, okay, we're going to do this training. We're going to focus on this. It was just all organizational. Then they went and trained. Then they went and had dinner. Afterwards, and dinner was everyone around the table just sort of chatted with each other, and they were in cliques, but there was no one who brought them all together. There was no talk. There was no welcome. It never happened. And he told me this went on a week, and he ended up on the Saturday afternoon appearing in front of 80,000 people live and millions on TV, feeling like an outsider the whole time. They'd never connected him to the shirt, to what he had actually joined. And he didn't play his best. Let's put it that way. So to me, that we can do better than that.
Well, you talk about that, right? These principles of belonging, right? The first sort of two is sort of find that identity story and then define that shared purpose that you have together. And you're very intentional. I love in the book as you talk about how you research and you look into these identity stories of different groups, and how you do this and you present it. And I think a lot of times you're surprised that they have no idea about the history or whatever. They know a couple of highlights, but they really don't understand what this is. So you've talked about, in diversity, the first Black rugby player for this team or cricket team or something like that. I mean, just talk about that. Like you spend a lot of time. That sounds like that's a lot of the work you do is diving deep into that identity story.
Well, in terms of my work, I look at the macro architecture of a team. Have we got a clear sense of purpose? Have we got a vision of what we're actually trying to achieve together? Have we got an identity story? And things like values, to me, should be an expression of our own identity story. They shouldn't be something that we Google or just invent one day on a whiteboard. Values are literally what this group of people value. And to me, that's really important, that we have a story that attaches to that, and we have examples of what those values look like when they're being lived. So I look at those macro things, and then the other part of my work is looking at the more micro things, which I'd sort of call team dynamics or the silent dance, as I mentioned. But when I work with teams and coaches, I think often they don't feel confident in, or how do I create a story of us? So, I mean, look, a US example would be if I was selected to go or recruited by the Green Bay Packers or the New York Yankees or the Los Angeles Lakers, doesn't matter, any team, I'm going to feel a little bit ripped off, to be honest, if no one actually explains to me this is the coolest tribe team you could have ever joined.
Yeah.
Let's tell the story. I'm going to tell you about Magic Johnson. I'm going to tell you about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I'm going to tell you about when we are great, what we look like.
Yeah.
These words on the walls, I'm going to tell you the stories of where they came from. And I'm going to show you what they look like when we live them. And it's that. It's not a piece of marketing or branding. It's incredibly practical. And then what we do as well is as we started to create our own chapter in this identity story. So actually the values, our reference points become ourselves, because we're living this and we're bought into it. So that's what I like to do with teams. We go back to the origin story, where they come from, and often there's some absolute gold in that. And then we talk about some of the ancestors and some of the legacies of teams before us. And not always the highlight package. Sometimes actually we failed, or we really let our tribe down, our fans down, because we got it wrong. But that's still really relevant information for us. So this is what it looks like when this organization is great. And this is what it looks like when we are selfish and when we let people down. So what's a vision for what we want to be? So all of these things together, it's not just doing a bit of historical research. It's really to utilize in our journey going into the future. That's the point of it. It really galvanizes us. It gives us confidence and belief. And it's a way that we are going to do it.
When you talk about that, and when I was reading about that in the book, I was thinking of this moment of a great coaching mentor of mine, and I was at his house in the NCAA program that he ran. We went down into his basement, and as you walked along the walls, it was like the timeline of the program that eventually at this point has won 6 national championships. He's retired now, but from the first year, and here's the first team, right? And when him and his wife were painting the fields and lining the fields and whatever, to here's the first Final Four, and here's the first national championship, and here's legendary players and the players of the year and the All-Americans, and just the team through the years up till today. And as you talk about that, I can still picture the basement. Now, I was done with my collegiate career at that point, and all I was thinking is that moment was, I wish I played here, right? I wish I felt like I was part of this. And even, I feel attached to that program today because of that moment, and I didn't even play there. You know, and so it's such a powerful thing, and yet we don't do it. How would someone like me do that when I coach 13-year-olds at a club that's only been around for 20 years? How do I create an identity story?
Well, there's, the club would have its genesis or origin story, so you can delve into that. There might be a few clues there that we can bring into and make it fun or relevant. I think what I like to do with the team is to consider who cares about us. So this community we're in, they care about us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. They come and watch us. What do they want to see in us? If we could be a beautiful mirror, what would they see when they come and watched us play? What would it look like? And that would also be a reflection of the type of community you're in. If you're in a rural community, it's a bit different than in a city community. They're all different. So it's contextual.
Yeah.
But, as the community you live in, I'm sure it's got its own sort of identity. It's and so we want to mirror that. We want to show people the traits that they respect around here, which may well be things like being selfless and working your butt off,
Mm-hmm.
and having some courage, whatever those ideas are. So we would have a conversation about, this isn't just about us, this is about everybody who was part of this club.
Mm-hmm.
And we want to express their identity and our identity. And then what I would do is marry that with asking the group themselves, what do you want to be? How do you want to be remembered? What do you want this experience to be like? Tell me. And this starts to form this identity as well.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, they may say, we want to have a lot of fun and we want to develop friendships during the season and we want to get better.
Mm-hmm.
And what we do is we build that into our story.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what we're doing here, our identity story, there's a group of people who make others proud when they come and watch us just by the way we are, not by the scoreboard alone, that's for sure. But we've also got a clear sense of, this is how we want this experience to be like. Mm-hmm. And as a coach, my role is to facilitate that. If you want to be better friends with each other by the end of the year than you were at the start, then my job, that is part of my coaching job, as important as anything else, to make sure that happens. Mm-hmm. So we will create space in order for you to get to know each other and have some shared experiences and some fun. If you want to get better, okay, we're going to develop, you individually. And so, yeah, that's the type of things. I think it's both thinking about our tribe and our stakeholders community, and also what we want to be as the best version of ourselves, and marrying it together.
I love that. I mean, that's fantastic. You probably could hear me scribbling down there, because there's not a single coach listening to this today who couldn't do this with their group, right? You don't have to be working with Gareth Southgate in England or the All Blacks or a national team. You can do this with your community team, because everyone has an answer to who cares about us and what do we value, and what do people want to see in us, and what do we want out of the season. And it's such a great exercise to do. And it feeds into this idea of, now this gives your players, regardless of age, some shared ownership of it as well, right? Like, this is who we want to be and what we want to do. So we own that. And then because we got to weigh in, now hopefully we're going to buy in as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I will share a story around my son's rugby team when he was in the under 11s, which is also in the book as well. But we were living in New Zealand, and then we relocated in the middle of the rugby season, and he joined this new club. And he'd only been there for 3 days, and they had their big game of the season basically against a nearby village. We live in a very rural area of England, and so there's big rivalries between the different villages. And they were playing, and the scores were tied at half time. And I'm just watching this. We're just new to the club. Obviously, this is our very first weekend there. And at half time, the opponent, they went and did the traditional thing you see in kids' sport. they went to their side of the field at halftime, and the coach came over, sort of bustling over, looked agitated, started shouting. Some of the kids were going to their parents. A couple of kids were seen to be arguing amongst themselves. A couple were lying down the grass. The coach was pointing down the field where he thought they should have been playing, and just grumpy, to be perfectly honest. And then he subbed in a few guys and subbed out a few guys, and it was like probably what you typically would see in kids' sport. But our team was completely different. I couldn't really believe it. I was standing there on the sideline, and for those 5 minutes of half time, these 11-year-old boys were in a huddle with their arms around each other, and no parent, coach, anybody went near them.
Huh.
And for the whole 5 minutes, they just, and 11-year-old boys are not necessarily the most communicative, but these boys were locked in with each other. And I could tell they were looking in each other's eyes, and their body language was strong. You could really see it. And I thought, wow, this is friggin' phenomenal. Mm-hmm. And anyway, and no one knew what I did for a job, obviously. I just arrived. So I just watching this thinking, oh my God. And second half, we scored 4 times. The opposition didn't score at all. And they all came off the field, and it was beautiful, really. And we all went into the club rooms afterwards. And I went over to one of the coaches and I said, that was pretty cool coaching at half time, how you just left those boys alone. Where did that come from? And bear in mind, these coaches, one's a farmer, one's an electrician. They're not, I don't think that they've even got formal training qualifications, right. Coaching qualifications. They're just dads who coach. But what they said was, at the start of the season, we chatted to the boys and we asked them, why do you like playing rugby so much? And they said, because, when you play football sometimes, soccer sometimes, people are shouting at you and telling you what to do. But in rugby, the game's so fast, it doesn't really happen. So you just got to make decisions on the field and got to figure it out yourself. Yeah. So the coach, these are a couple of dads. So they say, this is a pre-season. They say, okay, so you like that about rugby, do you? That you get to make your own decisions? And they said, yeah, we love that. Well, why don't we be different than other teams? Why don't we include that in our identity story? Why don't we just leave you alone at halftime? Because then you can really just not only decide when you're playing, but at halftime, why don't you just make decisions there and figure it out there, rather than us coming and telling you what the answers are or what we think they are. So the boys said, okay. And that's what they did. And, the amount of growth and improvement in that group, unbelievable. And the amount of trust that was given in them. But, it wasn't just a tactic. It was actually an identity they were building. This was a group of kids who by the end of the season felt like they were good at making decisions and solving problems because they've been entrusted with that. And it all came from this vision of the type of team they wanted to be.
I love what you said there. This wasn't a tactic. This was an identity, right? Because I could see people using that as a tactic. And then next week, we're using a different tactic, right?
We lose, so we throw it away.
Yeah, we throw it away. And versus you own it, you solve the problems. And then a coach can still come in and say, how'd it go? Are we good to go? Do you have any questions you guys weren't sure about that we could help with? Oh, you're good. Sweet. Back out there, figure it out. And this isn't a call for coaches to abdicate their duty and go, walk away at halftime. It's just to give them ownership. And there was a soccer coach, youth coach, Horst Wien, who I loved, and very, very influential in the youth footballing world in Germany and Spain. And he says, we have to stop treating children as empty vessels to be filled. And just, that they're human beings and it's in there and we just need to draw it out. And that's when we also really learn, like, what do they know?
Oh, so good, John. I mean, another thing too about the way those coaches did that was that trust, trust is our prediction of how others will behave. Now, if I'm confident in my prediction of what you're going to do next, then my anxiety level's lower. And therefore trust sits there. If I'm really not sure, confident what you're going to do next, then I'm going to have some anxiety, which compromises trust. I just can't really predict what's going to happen. So what I thought was another really awesome thing that the coaches were doing is at the start of the season, when they had this conversation and said, what experience do you want to have? What would be a great season for you? What do you want our identity to be? what do you want us to be different than other teams? All of these questions. And, this came out of it, is that maybe at halftime we could, figure it out ourselves and not get told the answers. Now, that was, the game we turned up for, the very first game, was like probably the most important game of the season. It would have been so easy for the coaches just to slightly have fudged that, or even completely ignored it and gone in there.
Next week.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it would have been very tempting. But if they had done that, the trust would have been compromised for the whole season, because they said something and the kids expected them to live it and honor it. And if they hadn't have, then they wouldn't have trusted them. They wouldn't have been able to predict what they were going to do going forward. So one of the other great benefits of them doing that in that game in particular was that the players really trusted them after that, because what the coaches said, they actually did it under pressure.
Yeah.
And what that enabled is, when you trust your coach, what does that allow you to do? It allows you to go to your coach and say, I don't really quite understand something that you just explained, or I'm not exactly sure what I'm supposed to do in my position, or even the game plan, or actually I'm a little bit scared because there's a big boy I'm playing against and I'm not sort of confident in my tackling right now. Yeah. So that was, it's just a multiplier, isn't it? Once you establish that level of trust, then your relationship is just fundamentally different, I reckon.
Oh, I totally agree. And that is, and then I think also it's the multiplier of that sense of belonging for the group, when in that game we were trusted and we solved it and it worked out in our favor. Right. And so now the sense of belonging and trust is just even stronger than it was the week before as well, which is versus we weren't figuring it out. The coaches had to intervene and we fixed it and we won. But we probably can't win next week without the coach.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's it.
It's crazy.
Massive, isn't it? And their mindset. Massive.
And this goes back to your first point of, this is the second most complicated task in the world versus actually it's really quite simple, right? Create belonging, create trust, and your players will perform to the best of their abilities with the tools that they have at this moment. And then each week in practice, we'll try to give them another tool.
Absolutely. Do you remember a couple of seasons ago when Steve Kerr allowed the players to call the timeouts and do that? Yep. And he was criticized for that. And I can sort of understand a little bit that some other teams felt it was disrespectful, and maybe underestimating them. I can understand that. But from a team culture point of view, I think that's got a lot going for it. Is actually step back and let them figure it out, particularly in a season game when maybe you've got the opportunity to do some of those type of things. But actually that was, still to this day, it was still, my God, what a crazy, revolutionary idea that the head coach might step back and let the players actually figure out how they wanted to play the game. And these are like proper grown-up adults, the best players in the world. Most of them probably fathers who are used to, dads at home. I mean, they're real well-rounded human beings, but for some reason, when it comes to sport, it's all far too complicated for them, and they need to be told what to do.
Right. When Steve was on the podcast, Jerry and I asked him about that very incident, because I remember it, and I've taken video of that and showed it at different talks and stuff. And I said, Steve, do you know of any other industry in the world where if you had, 4 of the top 10 people in the entire world in this space, that it would be considered rude and disrespectful to let them own the decision-making process? And then, of course, the answer is no, right? If you had 4 of the top 10 engineers in the world, would the boss say, listen, I know you're the best and we pay you $25 million a year, but shut up and just do what I told you? Like, give me a break, right?
Yeah. And one thing I learned, which in researching the book from Robin Dunbar, who's the head of evolutionary psychology at Oxford University over here, he explained to me, I had no clue about this, is that, for most of human history, we've sort of operated in bands of around 25 people. But one thing I hadn't appreciated was that those bands of 25 people or so, they are really, really egalitarian. And, they can still study hunter-gatherers today, obviously, but there's also sort of remnants from the past. But there wasn't a dictatorship. the group of 25 wasn't a dictatorship. In fact, there's lots of clues that they used to give their leaders a real hard time. If the leader was anything egotistical or in the slightest bit either selfish or put them in danger, they wouldn't tolerate it. And humans do have this hardwired expectation, not only for belonging, but also for fairness when they're in small groups.
Mm-hmm.
And so that idea of distributed leadership, which has been some wonderful writings on that over the last few years, General Marquette and Admiral Marquette and other writers, talk about distributed leadership and shared ownership as though it's sort of maybe a modern phenomena. It's not at all. It's actually the way we've always been. We've actually become distorted in over the last few centuries, is what I was taught, where communities and societies got much, much bigger than 25, in fact, got into millions. And then the type of leader that could actually run those was a completely different animal than the type of person that we're used to leading us. And so therefore we've developed some sort of tolerance for quite dictatorial, egotistical leaders in big scale human endeavors. But actually when it comes to smaller groups, we still expect and want them to be fair and to share ownership with us.
Yeah, totally. And we want that person to serve us, right? That the idea of a leader, I think, on a great sports team is someone who serves their teammates. And when they take on that selfless attitude of celebrating the success of the collective, that's when they truly become a great leader, a great captain, a great whatever, that book, The Captain's Class. I don't know if you've read that, but it's, it's fantastic, and it's not the star, it's the person who does the little things, the Bill Russells or the Carlos Puyol or people like that. It's great. And then the sort of the legacy of anyone within that group. And there's a Maori word, and I'm going to butcher it, so I'm going to let you pronounce it. Waka Papa. Did I say that right?
Well, yeah,
well, there we go. But that whole idea is your legacy is not what you have accomplished, but how you've made the shirt better, made the group better, right? So maybe just kind of talk about that. That kind of sums it all up. Yeah,
there's sort of two ideas that I think are really powerful, and they come from Maori culture, but I think they're universal. One of them is Wakapapa or Whakapapa, my tribe would pronounce it. And that's the idea that each of us are part of an unbreakable chain of people going back to our very first ancestor, with our arms interlocked with each other. This unbreakable chain of people going back, but it also goes back into the future, right to the end of time. And this can be your family, can be your nation, can be your team, can be your college, any group of people you belong to. And this is the idea, is that we're part of this unbreakable chain of people right back to the first ancestors and to the end of time. And what happens is the sun slowly moves. It first shone on our origin story, our Genesis story, and it slowly moves down this chain of people. And obviously we all get revealed in turn. And when the sun is shining on us, our first obligation is just to inherit this culture that we're part of. It's not about us. Our first role is to make sure that the tribe, the group is strong. So we inherit the culture, our identity, story, our sense of purpose, our values, rituals and traditions. And we live to that standard when the sun is on us. And we are driven to leave our own legacy, which is strengthening this group by what we did when it was our turn. But we also understand that people will come after us, and we need to make sure they're as strong as possible as well by us passing down the culture to them. It's our turn to be the custodians to pass it down. So all of these things are ways that sort of Maori people would look at the world. But, worked in the States and worked in lots of different places. And I find, Native American Indians have some very similar ideas. There's I think they're universal ideas, to be honest, that we love that idea of being part of something bigger than ourselves. It gives an incredible strong sense of belonging when you've got your arms interlocked with people either side of you, that's for sure. So there's that idea. And there's another concept which is very powerful called mana, M-A-N-A. And mana is not an easy translation, but it's a very high form of respect. It's something that you cannot bestow upon yourself. It's something that other people must determine for you. But in order to have mana, there are certain rules. The first rule is that you are humble. There is no, and in my culture, humility is probably the most important value. There is no tolerance of people being egotistical and selfish. So you have to have humility, first of all, to bring respect to yourself and to the tribe you belong to. The second thing is you have to be seen to always be motivated by what's best for the tribe and not for yourself. That can never, ever be compromised. So if you do those two things, if you're humble and you are always seen to be putting the group before yourself, then your mana will be high, which means that the way people look at you, the respect you have is high. And that's really the highest expression of being a human being, is when people think of you in that way. And that's what your reputation becomes. But you lose your humility or you become selfish. Those things are gone. And it doesn't matter how rich or wealthy or social media followers you have not left a good legacy.
Yeah. And this is, I think, the power of sport at any level and the power of coaching to teach this at every level, because certainly what we would call popular culture or social media, that's not the message you're getting, right? That message is be selfish, get what's coming to you, more likes, more popularity, more money, whatever it is. It really goes against belonging and connection and vaka papa, right? Did I say that right? There were the little, okay, right. Like that I am just, the sun is just shining on me for my moment. And the idea is to, make the collective better while the sun shines on me. And that is not the message that our children, that our people get from popular culture at all these days. And this is where I think sport can be a very powerful thing beyond sport.
It's so true. And, in Western societies, and I suppose the United States is right up there, they're very individualistic societies. You are conditioned to what's your purpose in life? What's your vision for you? What's your personal values? And a lot of the world, probably most of the world, are actually from a collectivist mindset, Asia, Africa, Polynesia for sure, is where those things don't make any sense to us. Like, what's our personal purpose? We don't have one. Our purpose is what our tribe or family need from us. What's our values? We don't have personal values. We have values that we've inherited from the groups we belong to. It's a very different way of understanding yourself. And, I freak out when people say to me, what's your purpose in life and what's your vision? I honestly don't have it. It depends what team I'm connected to and what they're trying to do. And certainly with my family, we have a sense of what a good life would look like, and we aspire to that. Yeah. But, I don't like people pointing fingers at athletes and saying, selfish and egotistical. I honestly feel it's so much determined by our environment. And, over here, there's an insight from the English Institute of Sport that 70% of behavior is determined by whatever environment you're in. So, that's where I think Steve Kerr, Pete Carroll, these guys are brilliant, is that they may have the biggest ego in the league, but they will be confident when they bring them into their environment that they have this belonging and sense of shared identity that actually moderates those selfish behaviors and makes them think of the team first. And, again, Phil Jackson, the way he managed Michael Jordan was phenomenal.
Or Dennis Rodman, which is a really interesting one, right? Perfect. Our culture, our environment can tolerate and shape that person. And then we can take those great skills that he possesses and they will benefit us. Right. But only if our environment is right can we bring in a Dennis Rodman or whatever. And this is what a Pete Carroll can do or a Steve Kerr can do is take a chance on that type of person. And it's a wonderful thing. Well, I mean, Owen, this was fantastic. The book is Belonging, and I know it's when this publishes, it'll be available around the world. How can people get the book, and how can people connect with you?
The book's been published already in a few countries, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, I think, and then some other countries, including the States and Canada. I think it's coming out in a few weeks. I think Amazon and those sort of
Barnes and Noble and all those places.
Yeah, I think so. But it is being published in the States. You don't have to send for it from overseas. It's been fun, and I've enjoyed, the fact that you had a pre-read of it and the feedback you gave me. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And do you have a website or any way people can follow your work on a more continual basis?
I'm on LinkedIn really.
Yeah.
That's I don't post a huge amount, but I do pick up my messages there, and I don't have a website as such. I sort of been a bit too busy for that, but maybe I'll have to think about it. But yeah, it's always nice to get messages from people and to connect with new connections.
Well, that's how we connected, and so I will assure people that that is a good way to track down Owen. So awesome. Well, this was wonderful, great conversation. I think we covered a ton of ground here, and obviously there's a ton more in the book. Like I said, I really enjoyed this. It sat by my nightstand for a while. I had notes in the margins and lots of things underlined and thoughts that really stuck with me. So congratulations and thanks for this great contribution. And I know that I will go out as I am beginning a new season with my son and his kids that I'm coaching right now and be a little more intentional about a few things because of our conversation today. So thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you. I've been a fan of the podcast for a very long time, so it's a real honor for me. Thank you.